Hello and welcome. The yin postures in this yoga practice will include Sphinx pose, happy baby pose, melting heart pose, both sides of Sleeping Swan pose, frog pose, Reclined Butterfly pose, and an opportunity to practice legs up the wall for Shavasana. That said, if you like legs up the wall pose, then you'll need some wall space for legs up the wall. Other things that might prove useful might be a yoga bolster and all kinds of soft padding like blankets and pillows. The stories I tell during this practice will have a bit of a math theme to them, the main one being the math bee. This practice starts in your favorite version of Sphinx pose. So any kind of prone back bend here. So make your way onto your belly, legs comfortably extended out behind you. And it can be your version. It can be just lying on your belly, head kind of resting in your hands. Maybe you have a bolster underneath your upper torso. Maybe it's just regular Sphinx with elbows underneath your shoulders, shoulder width apart, so that you can just rest your body weight, transmit your body weight through your upper arm bones. You might have to experiment here. Maybe you have a really supple back, and so in order to feel anything, you can come up into seal pose. So again, find your version here, settle here. We're starting off right away with this long held yin posture, Sphinx. So you want it to be something that you can stay in for a few minutes here. And this is the idea behind the end, is muscle relaxation, and then finding an edge, finding a range of your end of range of motion. Usually in Sphinx, it's this light compression in the middle to low back here. And then you just hang out here. Head can hang, head can be up. You can put your head on a block here and just settle. Notice, maybe some focus and attention is required here. To notice the tension in the muscles in the body, allow them to soften. Notice your breath here. And if you want to, try to slow down and lengthen the breath, since this is going to have kind of a numbers and a math theme to today's practice. I'm going to suggest just a simple 5 to 5 breathing, which is a 5 count inhale and a 5 count exhale. So after your next exhale, when you inhale, just a nice easy cadence of 5 as you inhale and fill up your torso. And then a nice easy cadence of 5 on each exhale. This is maybe gently and softly a longer breath than normal. That might help you to create that focus. It also involves using a few numbers here. Some of us have a little bit of anxiety about math and about numbers. And what we find that it's not just attention and focus that we need to deal with math. It sometimes requires a little bit of grace and surrender, which is something we don't think about in the logical experience of the language of math. It's the same with our bodies and our being. So any kind of yoga practice, one kind of intention that you can cultivate, or when you are cultivating some kind of an intention for practice, remember the ideas of grace and surrender, no matter what kind of practice. Certainly, it's very helpful in this long-held yin practice. But it also can be helpful in even an extremely young, energetic, hot and sweaty power yoga class as well. So any kind of practice, any kind of yoga practice think about attention and focus is useful. So is grace and surrender. And it can be useful other areas of life, other areas of math can help us with the struggle. Maybe another minute here in Sphinx. So Einstein, he had a great imagination, a great intuition, and it was those things that he used to develop his theories of light and of gravity, of special and general relativity. And yet he struggled with creating the math and using the math to describe to describe his ideas. He really did struggle. He struggled with the math, and yet the math was needed to precisely describe the experience that is light, experience that is gravity. Sometimes we have difficulties coming up with describing the experience that we're feeling in our inner landscape here. So maybe two more breaths here in Sphinx. Then when you're ready to come out of Sphinx, you can maybe just slowly lower yourself all the way onto your belly. You can rest your head on top of your hands, maybe one cheek on top of the hands, and just stay here to let the spine neutralize. We were there for a little over 4 minutes or so in Sphinx. And then when you're ready, make your way back into a wide-legged child's pose. So come up on the hands and knees and then keep going. Bring the knees wide, maybe they're shoulder width or mat width if you're using a mat, or you might be wider than mat width. Hips go back towards your heels until they stop, and then lower your torso, extend your arms forward. We'll do a couple of lateral bends while we're here in extended arm, wide-legged child's pose. So start walking your extended arms and hands over to the right side so that you're extending and opening up through your whole left side body. And then you're just going to kind of walk things over until they stop. You're finding your edge here. This is just a little bit of a counter pose before the next yin posture. So if we're not here for very long, but we're here for long enough for you to settle, soften, and sink into this pose. Maybe get in touch with your breath here. And after a while, you might be able to spider walk your fingers a little bit farther to just add a little bit more stretch to that left side here. And then just notice where the compressions and the tractions and the tensions actually are here. And then after your next breath, start making your way back to center. You can maybe pause here in center for a moment. Then we'll do the other side. So now you just start walking your hands and arms over to the left side. You're kind of opening up, waking up that right side here. Maybe sending breath into that right side. Although maybe your left side needs some breath too. You sink and settle here for a couple more breaths. And then bring yourself gently back into center. Bring yourself up onto hands and knees. And then slowly come to lying on your back. So the next long held yin posture is happy baby pose. The yin version of it, and simply the yin version of happy baby is holding happy baby for a long time. There'll be some options here. So from lying on your back, bend your knees and draw your knees into your chest. Now, you can just simply, if this is enough for you, you can just simply lie here. Maybe hands clasped behind your thighs in front of your shins and just kind of give your knees a hug. This can be your pose. Or you can keep going deeper into this hip opener. So knees go out on either side of your torso, and then weave your hands in between your legs to find your shins, your ankles, or the bottoms of your feet. Maybe this is as far as you go. So you just stay here. This is your happy baby pose. Or maybe you start pointing your bottoms of your feet up towards the ceiling, and then maybe use a little yang muscle energy in your arms to kind of gently pull on your feet your shins, your knees, so that they kind of get closer to the ground here. If you want to, we're going to stay here for a few minutes, but if you want to initially, you can gently rock your low back and forth here. This is kind of what we do in maybe a normal yoga practice. We're only going to be in happy baby for a few breaths. But at some point you'll settle, come back to stillness. And this is where we'll stay. We'll stay for another 3 minutes or so here. And again, if this gets too intense for you, you can come back to another version of happy baby, or even come out, maybe do some gentle twists here or so. Sometimes it takes a little bit of surrender and grace in this practice, and a little bit of surrender and grace when working with trying to figure out interesting math problems. Which reminds me of a story. So a long time ago, there was an old man who had 3 sons. And when the old man died, he left his sons, he had all he had to give his sons was these milk cows, these Holsteins. So he had 17 Holstein cows. And when his sons read the will specified that the oldest son should get half of the cows. And the second oldest son should get 1/3 of the cows. And the youngest son should get 1/9 of the cows. And so they thought about this for the longest time, and they couldn't figure out how this was going to work. They were really frustrated. They got to the point where they were about to take the cows off to the butchers to honor the will. So they went to the old man's brother, their uncle. And he told his uncle about their problem. Their uncle thought about it for a while. And he said, "Well, boys," he says, I don't know what the solution is to this problem. So I'm going to meditate about it tonight, see if I can come up with a solution." So their uncle went home, he set up his little yoga space and a little candle, a little incense, and he sat there and meditated through most of the night. Finally got tired, went to bed, woke up in the morning. Went back to talk to his nephews, and he said, "Well, boys," he says, "I tell you," he says, "I meditated all night and I couldn't think of a darn thing." He says, "I came up with absolutely nothing." He says, "I'm sorry. But I tell you what," he said, "boys, he says, I actually have 1 cow. I have 1 Holstein, and you can have her." And so he gave her his Holstein, and now they had 18 cows, and now all of a sudden the math worked. The first son, he got half of the cows, he got 9. The second son, he got 1/3 of the cows, he got 6. The youngest son got 1/9, he got 2 cows. And 9 and 6 and 2 is 17, so they give their uncle his cow back. Just one more breath here, and whatever your version of happy baby pose is, and then you can slowly release the feet, or wherever you've been grabbing your legs, draw the knees back together. Maybe give the knees a gentle hug. And then for a couple counter exercises here, first, maybe some full body lengthening. So lengthen out those legs long, maybe flex the feet, point the heels and press the heels away from you, and then extend your arms up overhead, lengthen out through your arms, and kind of maybe even wiggle here a little bit to lengthen each arm and each leg back and forth and grow really, really long here. Stretch with all you can. And then at some point release, gently bend your legs, roll to one side. You make your way onto hands and knees. Another little exercise to get ready for the next yin posture, which is melting heart. We'll do a few rounds of cat and cow first. So come onto hands and knees. Nice stable position here, neutral back here, so table pose here. And then since we're going into a back bend, let's start out with kind of a little bit of a forward fold here. So cat pose first. So arch your spine up towards the ceiling, tuck your head in your chin, tuck your tailbone here. Cat stretch. And then sink your belly down, come into a arch, back bend here, cow pose. And then just start moving back and forth between those two. So I call this cat and cow rolling. And you can bring a breath cadence into this, a vinyasa, if you will. So maybe you inhale and you're in cow, and you exhale and you're in cat, or the opposite. Try the other way, maybe that works better here. So maybe one more cycle between cat and cow. And then move into our next posture. In yin, this is called melting heart pose, but the shape is often called puppy pose in other yoga classes. So from hands and knees are nice and stable width apart. And then you start walking your hands forward and you melt, just like the name of the posture. I like melting heart actually better than puppy pose. You're melting your sternum, your upper torso, straight down towards the ground. You're softening your torso so that it sags and sinks into a back bend. And what you're doing is you're setting up traction in the upper torso and in the shoulders here. So this is, and then sink down. Hands are kind of rooted into the ground, but at some point, arms soften, shoulders soften. And for most of us, we're trying to feel something here in the upper body or so. So this is melting heart. We'll stay here for a few minutes. However, for some of us, this is too much pressure on the shoulders or something else is going on, and melting heart is essentially a back bend. So an alternative, if you have a yoga bolster, then a mini back bend on this bolster is maybe an alternative. So you'll sit, come to seated, legs out in front, sit up against the back end of your bolster here, and then lie back on the bolster. So you get a little bit of a mini back bend here in the sacrum and the lumbar here. And then this is where you can just stay. We'll do this again when we get to Reclined Butterfly. So the legs for this one can just either be straight, or I can recommend a little bit of internal rotation by bending your knees, bringing your feet wide apart, and then dropping your knees together. And then you can just stay here. So this is for if you're not wanting to do melting heart here. So that's a nice alternative. Otherwise, we'll stay here in melting heart for a couple more minutes. Again, you get to determine your own time to spend in yoga postures, and it might be longer or it might be shorter here. Otherwise, settle down, check in with your breath, remind yourself of your intention. My intention is to just tell stories here. So, a long time ago, in a far, far away place, there was a young little boy. He grew up on a farm. He lived on a farm kind of relatively in the middle of nowhere. There wasn't a lot of people around. He went to this very small school, small rural country school, just one tiny building. There's so few kids around that this school served kind of 8th grade, kindergarten through 8th grade, so kindergarten all the way up through middle school. Basically 2 teachers, 1 teacher's for the elementary school, 1 through 4th grade, and then another teacher for 5 through 8. And that's where this young farm boy went to school when he wasn't working, wasn't helping his parents out on the farm. So we have a little less than a minute left in this posture here. And as he went to school as a young kid, talking about the first few grades of school, his grades weren't so good. He wasn't the brightest or the fastest kid in the world, and he discovered that he really struggled in math. He did okay. He didn't quite did as well in math as the other subjects. But what really got him was when he got into third grade. So when he got into third grade, he really began to struggle with math. And in third grade was the grade that he was introduced to long division. And long division was just his great nemesis. He completely froze up and had no idea how to even approach long division, to the point where he wasn't getting his homework done, and the teacher decided the way to correct this was to keep him in from recess. So while the other kids got to go out for recess, he had to stay inside and he had to work on his long division problems. He did that the whole year of third grade until he could finally do some problems. So one more breath here. Root through your hands and press yourself up back into table pose for a moment here. And then from here, we'll you can move into child's pose. It can be wide-legged child's pose like we did before. Knees can be together. Rest your torso down, and then arms. I'm going to recommend sweep your arms back just to allow your shoulders to droop forward here. If having your arms forward feels better, that's fine too. This is just a little bit of a counter pose, so one or two more breaths here. And then when you're ready, bring yourself back up. Moving into the first side of Sleeping Swan pose. Sleeping Swan is the yin name for the pigeon shape pose here. So come to hands and knees, and if this doesn't work for you, there'll be an alternative here. So from hands and knees, bring the right foot forward, kind of into a low lunge here momentarily, and then start working that right foot over to the left side of the yoga mat. And then start lowering your knees and your hips towards the ground. Now you might have to adjust the right foot, might have to bring the heel in closer to the hip. Or if you want more intensity, bring the heel farther forward, away from the hip. And you'll go until you stop. Some people will make it to the floor, some people won't. You'll float here a little bit. If the floating doesn't feel good, then you take some sort of prop. It can be a block or a pillow. If you have a fancy yoga bolster like I do, you can place it underneath the hips and the thigh so that you can root onto that prop here. So we're in swan right now. And then you can gently lower your torso down as far as it goes. You're going slowly because you're noticing the tensions building on your inner landscape. So maybe you stay on straight arms, maybe you get on forearms, maybe you put a bolster under your torso, or maybe you make it all the way to the floor. You're finding your edge. And then that's where we'll stay. But Sleeping Swan is not for all of us. So if Sleeping Swan doesn't fit your body, then slowly bring yourself out of Sleeping Swan. Come onto your back. You can do Eye of the Needle instead. So bend both knees. And then bring your right foot, right ankle to your left thigh. Right knee is bent out wide here. Stage number 1 for Eye of the Needle. Left foot stays on the ground and you can just stay here. Stage number 2 is bring the left leg in and then hold the left leg with your hands either behind the thigh or in front of the shin here. And then if you want to go even deeper, then you pull with your arms going in here. So that's a nice alternative if Sleeping Swan just isn't working today. So come back to your breath and your sensations. There's a little bit of attention and focus there. But there's also a little bit of surrender and grace. mixed in with this practice here. So all of 3rd grade, this young farm boy, he had a desk, he had a seat next to the window. All of 3rd grade, he would sit there and stare at these monumental long division problems that just would always get the better of him. He just couldn't figure it out. He could hear the kids, the other kids playing outside. He could hear them laughing, stare out the window, and he could see them having fun. And all he could do was turn back and stare at his long division problems. By the end of the year, he could actually manage them a little bit. And over the course of the next few years, as he started getting bigger and advancing in the grades, he began to really enjoy school, enjoy education. He was starting to see the writing on the wall. It was either farming, which he wasn't much interested in, or the fun time was actually getting to learn about the world in school. And he got better in all of his subjects, including math. So just one more breath here on this side of Sleeping Swan. And then we're slowly coming out here. So you can come out of Swan in downward facing dog. That's often what we do in a vinyasa class. You can slowly roll out of Sleeping Swan however you would like to get out. If you need to take a break and get the pressure worked out of the hip socket, you can do some reclined windshield wipers, some other kind of movement. But we'll set up for the other side of Sleeping Swan. So when you do feel ready, come back on hands and knees. And then now it's the other leg that comes up. So left leg up, right knee back into this little lunge. And then work that left foot over to the right. Lower the left knee and the hips. Maybe you need a prop, maybe you don't. Underneath the hips, maybe you need to adjust this. Remember, Sleeping Swan is a hip opener, not a knee opener. So sharp, biting, burning pain in the knee is not really what we're going for in this posture. So maybe you do need a prop, or maybe you need to do eye of the needle on this side. So we're in Swan right now, this nice little back bend here. And then for Sleeping Swan, you just lower your torso, whatever amount that you need. And then we'll settle here. Sleeping Swan, eye of the needle. Pretty soon, this young farm boy, he found himself in 6th grade. And he had a different teacher. He was in the upper room. He was in the middle school room now. And the upper grade teacher, who herself was not terribly good at math, noticed that he seemed to be pretty good at math now. His grades had improved and he seemed to enjoy it. And she had heard through the grapevine that there was a math contest in the area. It was called a math bee, and it was set up similar to a spelling bee. I guess someone decided that to have a competition in math would get kids more excited about math, and so there was this regional math bee, and she thought it would be a good idea if he signed up for it. So she called up his parents and she talked to his parents about it. They thought it was a good idea too. So both his teacher and his parents kind of wanted him to go, and when he realized that he was outvoted, even though he was kind of a quiet, shy kid who wasn't really interested in competitions or public spectacles. But he had no idea what a math bee actually was, so he decided to just go along with it. Well, the day finally came for the math bee. And not really knowing what it was, as he dressed himself as he normally dressed. He was, again, a farm boy in the middle of the nowhere, so he showed up in typical clothes that you wear on the farm, and he was in a high school gymnasium, one of the nearby towns, and it was full of people. It just absolutely shocked him how many people there. Filled the bleachers, so parents, kids, other relatives, and there was a row. This was a long time ago. So there was a row of 30 overhead projectors, and it turned out that the format of the math bee was that in each grade, 30 kids that were chosen would stand up, and they would be given a particular math problem. And they were given 5 minutes to work the problem on the overhead projector in front of everybody so that everybody could see them working real time. And then at the end of 5 minutes, they had to stop. And then there was a judge. There was a judge at each station, and the judge would judge the problem done correctly or incorrectly. And it was a process of elimination. If you got the problem done incorrectly, you were done. The judge would shake their head no, you had it incorrect, and you would sit down and you were out. So that kind of format. One more breath here on this side of Sleeping Swan here. Slowly bring yourself up out of Sleeping Swan. You can come up into downward facing dog if you like that kind of young counter pose here. Or something else you can do. Again, windshield wipers, seated windshield wipers. Always my favorite after this kind of a hip opener. Any other kind of movement is good too here. And we'll set up for the next yin posture. So the next yin posture is frog pose. So I'll demonstrate full frog. And then some alternative is basically wide-legged child's pose is a baby frog version here. So for frog, you might notice now that I have this nice piece of padding of a blanket spread out and set up for a frog. You'll come to hands and knees, and then from hands and knees, start walking your knees and your shins apart. This is for full frog until they stop for whatever reason. And if you're trying this, then you'll know why. There's some of us will have a little bit of extra pressure on our knees or our ankles. So that's why the extra padding is nice here. So shins are roughly parallel to each other for full frog here. Your hips can either be forward or behind your knees. Usually the most intensity is when your hip is in line with the knees here. If that's too much intensity, and frog can be pretty intense for most people here. Move your hips forward or back so that the intensity is something you can tolerate here. And then you can come down onto your forearms, or you can actually, some of you can actually come all the way down here too in full frog. We'll stay here. But of course, full frog's not for everybody. So I'd recommend baby frog. And baby frog is essentially wide-legged child's pose. So bring your feet in towards each other. Maybe the knees come in. Sink your hips back towards your heels. And then come into this version of frog here, which is a lovely version of frog in and of itself here. We'll stay here for a couple more minutes here. Whatever version of frog that you've chosen here. So the farm boy looked around at the other kids that had shown up, and all the other kids were these slick city kids, and they were all dressed in their finest clothes. They were dressed in their Sunday best. The boys were wearing formal suits, and the girls were wearing just formal dresses. And the farm boy, he showed up in his old worn out work jeans that had holes in them, and he had his old faded tennis shoes that had oil spilled onto them, and he had his Pac-Man t-shirt on here. This was probably clear back in the early 80s when video games were coming online, and he was always a little bit thrilled with them, but of course he never got to play them because he lived out in the middle of nowhere. And anyway, he realized he kind of didn't get the memo on the clothing because he felt like a ship. He felt like a fish out of water. He wasn't dressed very well. He didn't realize it was this fancy of an occasion, but then he understood that he was going to be standing up in front of a huge crowd to work these problems. Maybe just one more minute here in whatever frog you're in. If this is too much, then 2 minutes is quite enough for some of us in frog. So he's starting to get very nervous and very anxious because this was not what he signed up for, and this is not what he was interested in, is to do math problems in front of a huge crowd of people, just on demand. And so he waited around for the other grades to do. This was the 6th grade. He had to wait for the 6th grade group to go up, and finally it was their turn. So all the 6th grade kids marched up to their overhead projectors. Again, this was a while ago. We didn't have PowerPoint or electronic dry erase boards here. And then they started working problems, and he was hoping that he would get a problem wrong so that he could sit down, because the pressure of being stared at while you're doing something that you didn't like doing was just too much to bear for a young kid. But he was always told to do his best, and so he did his best, and unfortunately he got the first few problems right, and he didn't get to sit down. He had to stay standing here. Other kids got to sit down. We can come out of frog pose now. So if you're in full frog, my recommendation is to just shift your hips forward until you're onto your belly, and then work your legs together. Bend your knees and do a bit of a prone windshield wipers to work out all that pressure that was building in the legs and in the hips during frog pose here. So this kind of prone windshield wiper maneuver. If you were in baby frog, probably can just sit up, do maybe some gentle twists here. Now the next yin posture is Reclined Butterfly pose. And this is where you can do Reclined Butterfly without any props. But if you do have a prop, like a bolster, you can create that mini back bend in the bolster, which I'm going to recommend. So if you have a bolster, then maybe practice. Otherwise, you can, if you're done with the back bending, you can do Reclined Butterfly without the bolster, and then you have a nice neutral spine. So you'll come to seated with the small end of the bolster up against the back of your torso, because you'll lean back on it here. And then bring your legs into butterfly legs. So knees bend, feet come together, and then knees go out wide, feet together, and then slowly lower yourself back onto the bolster, or if you don't have a bolster, all the way onto the ground here. And then allow yourself, by the way, feet can be closer or farther away from your hips. You can have extra padding underneath your legs if one of the knees feels unstable here. And the knees can float as long as they're not feeling torqued or unstable. Allow your upper body to just kind of relax, let your shoulders kind of ooze down either side of the bolster here. Head and neck are comfortable here. You can even add a pillow with your head and your neck. Arms are extended, maybe far enough from your waist so that your palms can face up towards the ceiling here. And then a few minutes here in reclined butterfly. So this poor farm boy, found himself into this very awkward, uncomfortable situation he just didn't want to be in. Here he was, pretty self-conscious, this huge crowd staring at him as he worked these math problems. He's just wondering when the suffering and the agony of all of this would just end. And he thought about just getting a math problem wrong, faking an answer, and then he got scared that maybe the wrong answer that he faked would actually be the right answer, and it just, the turmoil in his brain just kept building and building. He could feel the heat coming off of the overhead projector. And then came the next problem, and when the next problem was revealed to all the kids that were left, he noticed that it was a long division problem, his nemesis. And he felt a lot of emotions there in that moment. He felt the anxiety and the stress of being faced with the thing that he was least good at. He had to do it in front of all these people, and yet soon after he felt a little bit of relief. In fact, a lot of relief, because he knew he would get this problem wrong. There's no way he was going to get this long division problem correct. And he felt a bit of relief and a bit of grace, because he'd finally fail. He'd finally be done. And he would finally get a chance to sit down. People wouldn't look at him anymore. This was a bit of relief and surrender to him, and yet he still had these 5 minutes. We still have a couple of minutes here in Reclined Butterfly. He still had these 5 minutes to work the problem. And since he had nothing else to do, he decided he would get to work and just try and see what he could do. He knew he was going to get it wrong anyway, so why not? Pressure's off, because failure is imminent. And so that's what he did. He spent the next few minutes, and he kind of forgot about the people staring at him. He forgot about the judge watching him. He worked on the problem, and pretty soon there was nothing left to work. He had done all that he could do, and so he put his marker down. Pretty soon the buzzer rang for the 5-minute mark here. We still have about a half a minute here to go. And when that happened, he looked up, he looked at the judge, and he was waiting for that. He was waiting for the shake, the kind of the slight frown, and the shake of the head to tell him that he had got it wrong, and then he could finally sit down. And yet he was surprised, because instead of the frown, there was a brief smile from the judge, and she actually nodded her head because he had gotten the problem right. And again he was filled with agony, because even now long division betrayed him. This time it betrayed him by getting it right. But that means he had to still stand there and continue to work problems, which is not what he wanted to do. Whatever your feelings about Reclined Butterfly, we're kind of through with this posture. So when you're ready, bring your knees back up to center. And then maybe slowly, gently roll off to one side, off of your bolster, just onto your side. Maybe stay there for a moment, and then slowly bring yourself up. Just a little bit of integration, some simple seated twists before our final resting posture, which will be legs up the wall if you like legs up the wall. You can come to seated. I'm going to sit on my bolster here. You can just sit on the floor, comfortable seat here. Just a couple gentle twists here. So you can bring your hands on either side of your torso and then make a big sweeping circle with your hands and reach your arms and your torso up into the air to just go long. This is to help cultivate a neutral spine here. And then gently twist over to the right side. Arms can come down. You can put your hands on the floor or your legs for a little bit of stability. Stay here for a couple breaths. Maybe grow tall on an inhale and see if there's any more depth in the twist on the exhales. And then bring yourself back to center. You can do the same thing with the arms again. Big sweeping circle up towards the ceiling. Grow long and tall here, and then very gently twist and lower the arms to the other side. To the left here. A couple breaths here. Just to work out some of the kinks from all the forward and back bending, hip opening here. Bring yourself back to center. You can do a little bit of a counter twist. And then I always call this time, take some time for some free form yoga. Any kind of posture or movement strikes you is like your body's kind of craving. And then that's what you do now for the next few breaths. And then you set yourself up for your wet resting posture at the end of practice. It can be traditional shavasana, which is lying on the floor, or I'm going to suggest legs up the wall here for the final posture. So find some wall space. You can have a prop like a bolster or a blanket to put your hips on, your low back on, or nothing at all here. This is kind of yogi's choice. Sit next to the wall. The hardest part of legs up the wall is actually getting into legs up the wall. So you can roll a few times. Sometimes this takes 2 or 3 tries to kind of roll your legs up to the wall here. We're trying to keep our hips as close to the wall as possible. Some of us not going to be able to get our hips against the wall because of tightness in the legs and the low back here. And then start cultivating a sense of softness and comfort. You can use a pillow underneath your head. You can have more padding underneath your torso. If you're cold, put on more clothing here, or cover yourself with a blanket. Make this posture as accessible and comfortable as possible. If that's not possible, then maybe a different restorative posture for Shavasana here. And this is where we'll stay, well, for the rest of this practice here. So soften the face, soften your eyes, soften the tension in your arms and your torso, your hips, your legs, your feet, your toes here. Can maybe do that with a little bit of motion at first. Rock your head back and forth, move your arms, and then slowly come into this state of stillness. And just release your mind. Just come back to this idea of grace and surrender. So that farm boy who unfortunately got his long division problem right. By the time they got to the long division problem, there were only 3 kids left. And the other 2 kids did not get their long division problem correct. So some voice came over a loudspeaker and declared the farm boy the winner of the contest. But because they had to determine 3rd and 2nd place, they had to have a runoff between the other 2 kids who got their long division problems wrong. And because of that, the farm boy got to sit down. And he got to take a break. And he got to rest. All because he actually came up with a bit of grace and surrender for that long division problem. Can you find a little bit of grace and surrender for this pose, for your body here in the final couple of minutes of this practice? At some point, bring yourself back. Deepen your breath. Make small motions with fingers, with toes. Expand that motion into hands and feet, arms and legs. Rock your head gently back and forth. At some point, gently bend your knees. If you're in legs up the wall, press your feet up against the wall. And you can maybe use your feet to press yourself away from the wall, maybe a centimeter or so. And then very gently roll over onto one side. When you get there, stay there for a moment. Cultivate a deep sense of gratitude, a deep sense of grace and surrender for your efforts, your practice, and for you, your unique manifestation in this universe. The universe is ecstatically joyful that you are here. And then when you feel ready, bring yourself up to a nice, comfortable, stable seat. When you get there, bring your hands together, heart center. I'll end this practice with an Om. The inner light in me honors the inner light in you. Namaste.